A German army technical establishment somewhere behind the lines, a workshop with a concrete floor, good light, and a row of engineers in white coats who are, by any reasonable measure, among the finest automotive minds on the planet. On the bench in front of them is a small, ugly, open-topped American vehicle. It has no doors. It has no roof. It has a flat windscreen that folds forward onto the bonnet. It weighs, complete, about the same as a large motorcycle with a sidecar. It has been captured in North Africa, or in Sicily, or off a wrecked column somewhere, and it has been brought back to be taken apart. And they take it apart properly, the way Germans take things apart, component by component, weighed, measured, sectioned, photographed, the engine on a stand, the transfer case opened, the axles on the floor in order, and they write a report. And the report, by the standards of German engineering assessments of Allied equipment, is complimentary. They find the engine simple but effective. They find the four-wheel drive genuinely capable. They note that the vehicle is crude in its finish, unrefined in its ride, and remarkably, almost stubbornly practical. They approve of it, and they miss, completely and totally, the single most important thing on the bench. Because somewhere in that pile of parts, on a casting, stamped into a housing, cut into a gear, there is a number, a part number, and a German engineer, if he had understood what he was actually holding, would have put the report down and gone very quiet. Because that same number, on that same part, was at that moment sitting inside vehicles in the Libyan desert, and in the mud of the Solomon Islands, and in a depot in Iran, and on a truck in the Soviet Union, and in a warehouse in Detroit, and in a crate on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And every one of them fit. Here is the figure. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built somewhere in the region of 640,000 of these things. 640,000. Now, hold that against the German equivalent, the Kübelwagen, Germany's light military car, designed by Ferdinand Porsche, a genuinely ingenious little machine, was produced across the entire war in a quantity of roughly 50,000. 50,000 against 640,000. And it goes further, and this is the number that ought to be taught in every military academy on Earth. The United States built more Jeeps than Germany built tanks, assault guns, tank destroyers, half-tracks, and Kübelwagen put together, not slightly more, several times more. America produced more of one small, doorless, uncomfortable runabout than Germany produced armored fighting vehicles of every type across 6 years of total war. The German engineers wrote a report about the four-wheel drive. They should have written a report about the number, because the Jeep was not a vehicle. It looked like a vehicle. It drove like a vehicle. You could take it apart on a bench in Kummersdorf and lay it on the floor and measure every piece of it and understand absolutely nothing. The Jeep was a proof. It was a demonstration delivered directly into German hands of what the American industrial system could actually do. And the men who took it apart, brilliant as they were, looked straight through it. This is not a story about a car. This is a forensic audit of the difference between building a machine and building a system that produces machines. And it is the story of how the finest engineers in Europe held the answer in their hands, wrote it up, filed it, and never understood a word of it. Part 1. The German Calculus. To be fair to the German engineers, and we should be fair to them, because they were not fools, and this story is not a joke at their expense. You have to understand what they were comparing the Jeep to, and you have to understand why their own vehicle was the way it was. The Kübelwagen, literally the bucket car. It came out of the Volkswagen project. Ferdinand Porsche, one of the genuinely great engineers of the 20th century, took the mechanical package of the people's car, the air-cooled flat-four engine, the torsion bar suspension, the rear-mounted drivetrain, and built a military body on it. And what he produced was, on its own terms, superb. It was light, absurdly light. 4 men could physically pick it up and carry it out of a bog, which they routinely did. It had generous ground clearance and portal reduction hubs on the rear axle, which lifted the axle up out of the mud. It had a limited slip differential. It floated over soft sand, where heavier vehicles dug in, and its engine was air-cooled. Now, why air-cooled? Because a water-cooled engine needs antifreeze in a Russian winter, and antifreeze needs glycol, and glycol was in desperately short supply in Germany. Because a water-cooled engine has a radiator, and a radiator is a large, fragile thing that a single rifle bullet can kill. Because water cooling means water, and water in the Western Desert is not a coolant, it is a strategic resource. So, Porsche built an engine that needed neither. It is a brilliant solution, and it produced about 25 horsepower. 25, against the American Jeep's 60. And the Kübelwagen was not four-wheel drive. It drove the rear axle only. All that cleverness, the portal hubs, the limited slip, the featherweight body, was in service of compensating for the fact that it could not drive all 4 wheels, because Germany could not afford the complexity, the weight, the fuel, or the production capacity to build a 4-wheel drive light car in quantity. And that sentence right there is the German war in miniature. Every German design decision of the Second World War, when you trace it back far enough, is a workaround for something Germany did not have. No glycol, so air-cooled. No fuel, so tiny engine. No production capacity, so rear-wheel drive with clever compensations. No rubber, so narrow tires. No steel, so light bodywork. The Germans were not being clever because they were clever. They were being clever because they were poor. Cleverness is what an engineer does when he cannot afford abundance. And here is the thing that a German engineer would never, ever have said out loud, but which every one of them knew in his bones. Cleverness does not scale. Because Porsche did try. Germany did understand that a 4-wheel drive light command car was better. They built one. It was called the Type 87, the Doorwagen, a 4-wheel drive vehicle on the Kübelwagen platform, and it was capable, and it was good. They built only a few hundred of them across the entire war. They built the Schwimmwagen, the amphibious version, an extraordinary piece of engineering, a car that could drive into a river and swim across it. And they built roughly 15,500 of those, and it is one of the most impressive vehicles anybody produced in the Second World War, and it changed absolutely nothing about the outcome. And that is the German disease, and it runs through every part of this story. Germany kept inventing. Germany could not stop inventing. Every problem produced a new design, a new variant, a new mark, a new specialized type. The Kübelwagen, and the Schwimmwagen, and the Doorwagen, and the Kettenkrad, the half-track motorcycle, which is one of the strangest and most wonderful vehicles ever put into production, and which nobody outside Germany would ever have thought of building. Every one of them was ingenious. Every one of them was a different set of parts, a different production line, a different spares chain, a different training program, a different repair manual. A German quartermaster in 1944 was trying to supply spare parts for an inventory of vehicle types that ran into the hundreds, including enormous numbers of captured French, Czech, Italian, Soviet, and British vehicles that had been pressed into service because there were not enough German ones. Think about what that does to a maintenance system. The German army was, by 1944, running an automotive museum and calling it a supply chain. And I want to put a number on that because it is one of the most astonishing facts of the entire war, and almost nobody knows it. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the largest military operation in human history, over 3 million men, the pivot of the whole war, a very substantial portion of its motor transport was not German. It was French, it was Czech, it was Austrian, it was Polish, it was Belgian, and Dutch and Italian. It was whatever the Wehrmacht had rolled up in 1938, 1939, and 1940, and had then pressed into service because German industry, for all its brilliance, could not build enough trucks. Estimates of the number of distinct vehicle types in German service during the invasion of the Soviet Union run into the many hundreds. Some accounts put it well over 2,000 types, when you count every variant, every captured model, every conversion, a figure widely cited by historians of German logistics, even if the exact count is debated. 2,000 types. Now think like a spare parts clerk in a depot outside Smolensk in November of 1941. A driver comes to you and says he needs a water pump. You ask him what for. He tells you it is a Renault, or a Citroën, or a Praga, or a Tatra, or a Fiat, or an Opel. And if it is an Opel, which Opel, and from which year? You do not have that water pump. You are never going to have that water pump. There is no factory anywhere in Europe still making it, because that factory is now making something else for the German army, and the tooling for the old part was scrapped. So the truck stops, and it stays stopped, and its cargo is transferred to a horse cart. The German army did not lose its motor transport in Russia, primarily to Soviet fire. It lost it to entropy. It simply wore out in a country with no roads, in a climate that destroyed machinery, and it could not be replaced, because nothing was standard, and nothing was interchangeable, and nobody in the entire Reich could tell you what was actually in the inventory. This is why the horses came back. This is why an army that had invented the armored breakthrough was by 1943 moving its artillery with animals. Not because it was backward, because its machines had died, and it had no way to resurrect them. And on the bench in front of those engineers in 1942 was a small, ugly American car that was the exact, precise, mathematical opposite of everything they had built. One type, one engine, one set of parts, 640,000 times. Part 2. The American Answer. The story of how the Jeep came to exist is one of the most ruthless things the United States Army ever did, and almost nobody tells it because it does not flatter anybody. In the summer of 1940, the U.S. Army put out a requirement for a light reconnaissance car. The specification was borderline impossible, and the deadline was insane. The Army wanted a running prototype in 49 days. 135 manufacturers were approached. Almost all of them looked at the timeline and declined. A tiny, nearly bankrupt company called American Bantam, with a handful of employees and a freelance engineer named Karl Probst, working initially without pay, designed the thing in a matter of days and delivered a running prototype on time. They did it against everybody. The little company won, and then the United States Army took their design away from them. Because the Army looked at American Bantam and asked the only question that actually mattered. And it was not, is this a good design? It was, can you build 200,000 of these? And Bantam could not. Bantam was a small company, with a small factory, and no capacity. So, the Army took the Bantam design, the blueprints, the concept, the layout, and handed it to Willys Overland and to Ford, two companies that could build at scale. That is a brutal thing to do. It is arguably an unjust thing to do. The men who invented the Jeep watched other companies build it and get rich, and get the credit, and American Bantam never recovered and eventually disappeared. And it was, from the point of view of the war, completely correct. Because the Army had understood something that the German procurement system never understood at any point in 6 years. A design that cannot be produced in quantity is not a weapon, it is a hobby. Willys refined the design and produced the MB. And then the Army did the second thing. And this is the decision that actually won it. Ford wanted to build its own version. Ford was Ford, the largest and most sophisticated mass production organization on the planet, run by men who genuinely believed, with some justification, that they knew more about building vehicles than anybody alive. And Ford wanted to make improvements. Ford wanted its own engine, its own details, its own way. And the United States Army said no. You will build the Willys design. You will build it to Willys blueprints. Every dimension, every tolerance, every part. And every single component you make must be interchangeable with the Willys part. Ford built the GPW. It stamped a small letter F onto its components, on the bolt heads, on the castings, so you could tell where a part had come from. And that F-stamped part fits a Willys. Take a Ford Jeep built in Michigan and a Willys Jeep built in Ohio by different companies, with different workforces, on different tooling, in different factories. Strip them both, mix the parts on the floor, rebuild both vehicles from the mixed pile. Both of them run. That is what those German engineers were looking at on the bench in 1942, and they wrote a paragraph about the transfer case. Now look at the engine. The Jeep's power plant was called the Go Devil. 2.2L, 4 cylinders, a flathead, a side valve engine with the valves in the block rather than in the head. In pure engineering terms, in 1941, this was already an old-fashioned layout. It breathes badly. It cannot rev. An overhead valve engine is better in almost every measurable way. The Americans built a flathead anyway, deliberately, because a flathead has no overhead camshaft, no push rods running up through the head, no complicated valve train. It is a simple, stupid, unbreakable lump of iron that makes a big pile of torque down low, exactly where a light truck in mud needs it. And crucially, critically, it can be maintained by a man who is not an engineer. There it is again, the same decision in a different machine. The Sherman's transmission was bolted on at the front, so a mechanic could pull it. The Jeep's engine was a flathead, so a mechanic could fix it. The American fuel was one grade, so a mechanic never had to ask what was in the can. Over and over and over, across every American weapon system of the Second World War, the same sentence is being written in different metals. Make it simple enough that an ordinary man can keep it running. The Germans optimized for the engineer. The Americans optimized for the mechanic. And there were a very great many more mechanics than there were engineers. But I want to go one level deeper than that, because there is something underneath the Jeep that is bigger than the Jeep, and it is the thing that actually decided the Industrial War. America did not build the Jeep in a car factory. I mean that literally. The Willys plant in Toledo was a car factory. But behind it stood something that has no German equivalent at any point in the war, and it is the single greatest industrial mobilization in human history. And it worked because of one boring idea. The idea is this: if a part is defined by a drawing and a tolerance, then it does not matter who makes it. A piston does not need to be made in a car factory. A piston needs to be made by a company that can machine a piston. That company might currently be making washing machines or typewriters or refrigerators or agricultural equipment or pianos. And if you hand that company a drawing and a tolerance and a gauge, it can make your piston, and your piston will fit. So, the United States took the entire manufacturing capacity of the largest industrial economy on Earth, every machine shop, every foundry, every stamping plant, every tool and die maker in every town in America, and it pointed all of it at the war at once, through the simple mechanism of the standardized drawing. Companies that had never seen a military contract in their lives were making gun components. Piano manufacturers made aircraft parts. A firm that made carburetors for lawn equipment made carburetors for Jeeps. And every piece of it fit, because every piece of it was made to the same drawing, to the same tolerance, checked with the same gauge. That is what the German engineers were actually looking at on the bench. Not a car. The visible tip of a manufacturing philosophy that had been building for 100 years and had just been aimed at them. And Germany could not answer it. Not because German industry was inferior. German industry was extraordinary. But because German industry was organized around the master craftsman and the hand-fitted part and the continuously improved design. And you cannot run that model across 10,000 subcontractors. You cannot subcontract genius. You can subcontract a drawing with a tolerance on it. And so, the Reich, which had the finest engineers in the world, could not get the whole of its economy to point in the same direction, while America, which had fewer great engineers and many more competent ones, turned the entire country into one enormous, unstoppable machine that made identical objects and shipped them everywhere. 640,000 times. Part 3. The River of Steel. Now we get to the part that a German logistician, if he had ever seen the figures, would have found genuinely difficult to process. 640,000 jeeps. Where do you put them? How do you move them? A ship has a fixed volume, and a jeep, however small, is a box of air with a car in the middle of it. You cannot float 600,000 of them across an ocean by driving them onto boats. So, the Americans took the jeeps apart. Jeeps were shipped disassembled in wooden crates, in what were called knockdown packs. There was a single unit pack, one jeep in a crate, and there was a twin unit pack, in which two complete jeeps were partially disassembled and nested together, so that two vehicles occupied barely more shipping volume than one. At the other end, in a depot in England or North Africa or the Pacific, a small team could open a crate and assemble a running jeep in a matter of hours. Read that again, because it is the whole American war in a sentence. They did not ship vehicles. They shipped the possibility of vehicles in flat-packed boxes and turned them into vehicles on arrival. And once they were vehicles, they went everywhere. Under Lend-Lease, the United States shipped tens of thousands of jeeps to the Soviet Union, along with something on the order of hundreds of thousands of trucks. The Studebakers, which is a story for another audit, and one that Soviet marshals were considerably more honest about than Soviet politicians ever were. The Red Army's ability to conduct deep operations in 1944, the thing that broke Army Group Center, the thing that ended the war in the East, was carried in very large part on American wheels. And in the West, the Jeep became something that no design specification had asked for, and no engineer had anticipated. It became the connective tissue of the entire army. It carried the officer to the conference. It carried the order to the battalion when the radio failed. It carried the wounded man to the aid station strapped across the bonnet. It towed the anti-tank gun. It carried the wire. It carried the mail. It laid the telephone line off a spool bolted to the back. It mounted a machine gun. It ran the reconnaissance patrol. It carried the reporter. It carried the general. It carried the chaplain to the burial. Ernie Pyle, who saw more of the American war from a foxhole than any correspondent alive, wrote about the Jeep with a kind of exasperated love. He did not think the army could have fought the war without it. He was probably right. And when Dwight Eisenhower was later asked what had won the war, he named a short list of tools, and it did not include a single tank, a single fighter aircraft, or a single battleship. He named the bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, the transport aircraft, and the Jeep. The supreme Allied commander in Europe, given the chance to name the war-winning weapons, named 4 machines that never killed anybody. He named the machines that moved things. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most striking things any Allied commander said about the Second World War, and almost nobody has ever taken it seriously. The supreme Allied commander did not name the Sherman. He did not name the Thunderbolt, or the Mustang, or the Flying Fortress. He did not name the aircraft carrier, or the battleship, or the atomic bomb. He named a bulldozer, a truck, a transport plane, and a jeep. Because Eisenhower had spent 3 years watching what actually happened. And what actually happened was this. The battle was decided long before the shooting started, by whether the thing was there. Was the fuel there? Was the shell there? Was the spare final drive there? Was the wounded man carried out in time? Was the order delivered? Was the road built? Was the bridge in? Was the airfield graded flat enough for the transports to land on? And the machines that did all of that were not weapons. They were tools. And America was, above every other nation on earth, a nation of tools. There is one more thing about the Jeep that no specification ever captured, and no engineer ever designed. And it is the reason the soldiers loved it. You could carry it, not tow it, carry it. 4 men, 6 on a bad day in deep mud, could physically pick a Jeep up and move it, out of a ditch, off a trail, across a gap in a blown bridge, onto a landing craft, into a glider. And they did put them in gliders, and they flew them into Normandy, and into Holland, and across the Rhine. And the airborne divisions came down out of the sky with Jeeps. Try that with a Kübelwagen, and you will succeed, because it is lighter still. Try it with anything else in either army, and you will not. The Jeep was small enough to be manhandled, and strong enough to be useful. And that combination, which sounds like nothing, which sounds like a footnote, meant that there was almost no terrain on Earth from which a Jeep could not eventually be extracted by the men standing next to it. An American unit did not lose Jeeps. It picked them up and carried on. And it had 640,000 of them. And that is the sentence the German engineers in that workshop needed to understand, and did not, and could not, because their entire professional culture pointed the other way. They had been trained, brilliantly, rigorously, in the finest technical universities in the world, to build the best possible object. The Americans had never been interested in the best possible object. The Americans were interested in the largest possible number of adequate objects, all identical, all repairable, all interchangeable, delivered everywhere at once. And in a war fought across 3 continents and 2 oceans, over 4 years, by armies of millions, the second philosophy annihilates the first. Not narrowly, not on points, completely. Part 4. The German realization. Here is the part of the story that German veterans were, in later years, remarkably candid about. They loved captured Jeeps. Every account of German units on the Western Front that got their hands on American vehicles tells the same story. The Jeeps were kept, they were prized, they were used, until the fuel ran out, or the tires wore through, or somebody shot them up. German officers drove them. German reconnaissance units used them. They were, quietly and widely, understood to be better than what the German army was issuing, and that fact, on its own, is embarrassing enough. But the deeper realization is worse, and it is the one the engineers in the workshop should have reached, and did not. A captured Jeep in German hands was a dying object, because when it broke, and it broke, everything breaks. There was no part. There was no Willys depot. There was no F-stamped casting in a crate in a warehouse. There was no 640,000-strong ocean of identical components sitting behind it. A German unit with a captured Jeep had a wonderful vehicle with a countdown attached to it, and every day that clock ran down, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do. The German army had the Jeep. It did not have the thing behind the Jeep, and that is the whole point, and it is why the technical report was worthless. You cannot capture a system. You can capture an object. You can take the object apart and admire it and write it up and file it. But the object is not the weapon. The weapon is the 640,000. The weapon is the fact that a Ford part fits a Willys. The weapon is the crate that turns into a vehicle in 4 hours in a depot in Casablanca. The weapon is the flathead engine that a farm boy from Kansas can rebuild in a field with hand tools because it is the same engine that was in his uncle's truck. None of that is on the bench. None of that can be measured or weighed or photographed or sectioned. And so a room full of the best automotive engineers on Earth took the American war apart, laid it out on a concrete floor in front of themselves, looked directly at it, and did not see it. They saw a car. Germany, to its enormous credit, did understand eventually that it had a production problem. There were men in the German system, Guderian, Speer, and others, who spent the last 2 years of the war fighting a losing battle to simplify, to standardize, to stop building new types, to build fewer things, and build more of them. They lost that battle. They lost it because the German system rewarded the magnificent object. It rewarded the engineer who improved the design. It rewarded the new mark, the better variant, the heavier gun. And a system that rewards improvement above all things cannot standardize, because standardization means freezing a design that you know with certainty could be made better. The Americans froze the design. They knew the Jeep could be better. They knew the flathead was obsolete. They knew the Sherman needed a bigger gun. They knew, and they froze it anyway, and they built 640,000 of the imperfect thing. And they were right. There is a final twist to this, and it is almost too neat, and it happens to be true. Germany did try to copy the Jeep. Late in the war, with the writing very clearly on the wall, German industry was ordered to produce a simplified, standardized, easily manufactured light military vehicle. Something cheap, something that could be built in volume, something that did not need a master craftsman. They understood the lesson. At the very end, with the bombs falling on the factories, they finally understood the lesson. And they could not do it. They could not do it, because standardization is not a decision you make in 1944. It is a decision you make in 1920 and 1930, and every year in between, in your factories and your engineering schools, and your industrial culture. It is a 100-year habit. America had been building the same washing machine in 100,000 identical copies since before Ferdinand Porsche was born. When the war came, all America had to do was point the habit at Germany. Germany, by 1944, was trying to acquire in 18 months an industrial reflex that the Americans had spent a century developing. While being bombed, while short of every raw material on the periodic table, while its skilled workforce was being conscripted and killed, and while its own leadership continued to demand new marks, new variants, new wonder weapons. It was not a close-run thing. It was never a close-run thing. The Jeep on that bench in 1942 was not a preview of a battle Germany might lose. It was a receipt. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Quartermaster Corps, in the Transportation Corps, in a motor pool, in an ordnance depot, or as a driver, in any of the units that moved the American Army from the beach to the Elbe, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. Almost none of them were decorated. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. Germany. The roads of the Reich are full of Jeeps. They are on every road, in every town, in every column. They are parked outside command posts. They are towing trailers. They are carrying prisoners. They are carrying correspondents. They are carrying the men who are writing the reports on the wreckage of German industry. And in the workshops and the proving grounds and the technical establishments that the Americans overran, they found the files, including, in various places, the German technical assessments of captured American equipment, the measured, careful, competent reports, written by first-class engineers who had taken the Jeep apart and understood everything about it, except the only thing that mattered. So, here is the verdict, and it is the least sentimental verdict I can give you. The Jeep was not a good vehicle. It was cold. It was wet. It had no doors. so men fell out of it. Its short wheelbase and high center of gravity meant it rolled over easily and often, and it killed a considerable number of American soldiers who never saw a German. Its ride was punishing. Its engine was obsolete on the day it was designed. Its steering was vague. Its brakes were poor. And it was, by any reasonable civilian standard, a fairly primitive machine. The Kübelwagen was, in several respects, a more sophisticated and more thoughtful piece of design. It did not matter. It has never mattered. It will never matter. Because the question was never which vehicle is better. The question was, how many are there? And does the part fit? Germany built a vehicle that was clever. America built a vehicle that was everywhere. And when those engineers stood in that workshop in 1942, with the Jeep in pieces on the floor in front of them, they were not looking at a captured enemy vehicle. They were looking at a message, and the message was not written in the engineering. The message was stamped on the parts. It said, "There are 640,000 of these, and every one of them is the same, and we can put one anywhere on Earth inside a wooden box, and any 19-year-old with a spanner can keep it running forever." And there is no answer to that. There is no clever design that beats it. There is no better engine, no smarter suspension, no more elegant solution. The Germans spent the war looking for the secret inside the machine. The secret was never inside the machine. The secret was that there were 640,000 machines, and they were all the same one. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, subscribe to www.Dark Legacy. That's what keeps this channel bringing you the history the way it actually happened. More audits are coming, more systems, more doctrines, more of the ordinary, invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won. And remember this about the men who drove them. Nobody made a film about a Jeep driver. There is no monument to a man who spent 1944 carrying orders and wire and wounded men over 1,000 miles of ruined French road in an open car, in the rain at night, without lights. He was not trying to be brave. He was trying to get the thing to the place it needed to be before it was too late. Mostly, he did. They deserved to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the work they did behind the wheel of the ugliest, coldest, most uncomfortable machine their country ever built, and the one that Eisenhower said won the war. Subscribe to WW2 Dark Legacy.